In February 1985, when Doctor Who's 22nd season was just wrapping production, Doctor Who's future was hanging in the balance. With rumours of the show's cancellation, an official press release was published on the 1st of March, detailing the 45-minute format was to be scrapped, returning to the original 25-minute format, and would return in September 1986. This would only be the start of Doctor Who's problems. Sure enough, in September 1986, Doctor Who would return in the 14-part Trial of a Time Lord, but behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. Michael Grade, BBC One's controller of programmes, and Jonathan Powell, the head of drama, offered to move John Nathan Turner off of Doctor Who on the condition that he agreed to inform Colin Baker that he had been fired from his role as the Doctor. This was a horrendous decision to make, but John Nathan Turner had been trying to leave Doctor Who since 1983's The Five Doctors, but with very little success. John phoned Colin in October to break the news, and shortly after he went on holiday. He returned only to discover that no one was going to take over from him, and so he had to go on. After selecting Sylvester McCoy as the Doctor, Andrew Cartmel was selected as script editor. Let's skip past season 24, which incidentally I have a massive soft spot for, and let's go to season 25, where Cartmel's master plan was trickling into the stories. This master plan, of which I'll go into more detail about later, would end up making the stories much darker and more mysterious. The following season, which we're reviewing today, would explore this more mysterious storytelling and create some of, in my opinion, the best 80s stories of Doctor Who. So let's start at the beginning with Ben Aronovich's Battlefield. On the 8th of September 1988, the BBC confirmed that Doctor Who had been renewed for season 26. A week later, mere weeks before his first Doctor Who story was broadcast, Remembrance of the Daleks, Ben Aronovich was commissioned to write Battlefield. This story would depict Knight Commander Ancelin, who was under King Arthur, in a parallel world in which Arthur actually existed, finding the Doctor and recognising him as the sorcerer Merlin. Stranger still, a spaceship beneath the waters of the nearby Lake Vortigern conceals the fate of the legendary King Arthur. The story also boasted a return of Unit and of course the Brigadier, played by the irreplaceable Nicholas Courtney.
Brigadier Alistair Gordon Lethbridge Stewart.
The story was certain to bring in large ratings, except it didn't. Coronation Street, which was what Doctor Who was put up against in the McCoy era, brought in 16.5 million viewers. Doctor Who, a mere 3.1 million. This was depressingly the final nail in the coffin for Doctor Who. 5 days after the debut episode, Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred were informed that season 27 was not to happen. But the rest of the season was still being broadcast, where Battlefield was followed by Mark Platt's Ghostlight, exploring more of Ace's backstory, much like the following two stories. These formed the Ace trilogy. This particular story showed Ace's past fears, the following story, The Curse of Fenric, showed Ace's current fears, and the final story, Survival, showed Ace's future fears of responsibility. This was very advanced for the time. A story arc was a fairly new thing for the show, and the last time that had happened was in 1978 with the Key to Time season. This is one of the reasons why Ace is my favourite companion. Her character has so much depth, which was explored in length in these stories. But now back to Ghostlight, where the Doctor takes Ace back to Gabriel Chase Mansion in her hometown of Perivale. Ace had gone into the house as a teenager and felt an evil presence, but now she recognises it as alien. After starting out as the story which would become known as Lungbarrow, which would see the Doctor facing his greatest fears by confronting his bizarre cousins in their ancestral home of Lungbarrow, J&T decided that it revealed too much of the Doctor's origins too quickly. However, he liked the spooky house setting, so Mark Platt wrote a different story, still set in the spooky house. This story was planned to be broadcast after The Curse of Fenric, and in that story, Ace makes a reference to an old house in Perivale.
Dark buildings. There was one in Perivale. Old empty house. Full of noises. Evil. Things I didn't understand. Undercurrents.
This was originally meant to be a foreshadow for Ghostlight, but the change in order turned it into a reference to a past unseen adventure. The episode, while not entirely making sense, still proves an enjoyable watch from beginning to end, perhaps because of the casting choices, specifically John Hainlam as Light and Sharon Deuce as Control, and of course the wonderful set design by Nick Somerville and complementary lighting by Henry Barber. This story was the last to be produced in the season, and thus sadly the final story to be produced in the classic run. The final scene to be shot was the scene where Gwendolyn and Lady Pritchard turned to stone. Now let's go back to the beginning, with the first story to be produced, The Curse of Fenric, written by Ian Briggs, who incidentally wrote Ace's first story, Dragonfire, and this story somewhat brings her character full circle, where she meets a baby called Audrey, the name of her mother whom she hates, and by the end of the story, we discover the baby is in fact her mother. With this, we discover Ace is actually one of the wolves of Fenric and has been touched by the curse, and her love interest Soren, who is a Soviet captain, is touched by it too, making for some very spooky scenes.
You think I didn't know? The chess set in Lady Painful's study? I knew.
Earlier than that, Time Lord. Before Cyberman. Ever since Iceworld, where you first met the girl.
I knew she carried the evil inside her. I think I'd have chosen a social misfit if I hadn't known. She couldn't even pass her chemistry exams at school, and yet she manages to create a time storm in her bedroom. I saw your hand in it from the very beginning. You're an emotional cripple. I wouldn't waste my time on her unless I had to use her somehow.
The music for this story too is excellent, wonderfully fitting for the story. Mark Ayres, who had composed the music for The Greatest Show in the Galaxy the previous year, and also the previous story, Ghostlight, creates an appropriate marching type momentum in the soundtrack, not only fitting in with the World War II setting, but also bringing some tension to many scenes. The Hemivores are also fantastic monsters. The masks are really scary, and the Ancient One, who is the oldest of the Hemivores, has the scariest of the masks. There's just so much to talk about with this story. It is essential viewing, much like the following and final classic story, Survival. The story goes back to Ace's roots in modern-day Perryvale, where all is not what it seems. Her old friends have been kidnapped by a race of alien hunters called the Cheetah People, who were shown the way to Earth by their doctor's old enemy, the Master. With the return of the Master played by Anthony Ainley, the episode does feel like a finale, not just to the season, but to the entire classic show. So let's start at the end and work our way back to the beginning. The final speech, which was coincidentally recorded on the 23rd November 1989, exactly 26 years to the day that Doctor Who began, and also the day that Peter Grisham, the BBC's head of series and serials, confirmed in the Radio Times that season 27 had been postponed, but promised that Doctor Who had not been cancelled. More on the cancellation in a future video, but back to the story now. As soon as the story moves to the home planet of the Cheetah People, the feminine symbols become apparent, but not so obvious that it affects the plot. This is probably due to Rona Munro's incredibly skillful writing. With so much packed into the 3 parts, it's amazing it doesn't feel cluttered. With both cliffhangers being suitably frightening, the first being the grand reveal of the Master, and the second being another grand reveal of Ace's eyes becoming that of a cheetah. The main cheetah person, Kara, played by Lisa Bauman, proves a very enjoyable character to watch, and her death is horrible. Once again, the music takes centre stage, with Dominic Glynn taking the reins. I really adore this soundtrack. The almost hacking violin sounds and the haunting piano riffs make the music not only atmospheric, but also fitting for the story. Dominic Glynn's Doctor Who music is some of my favourite soundtracks of the 80s, and his theme tune is great. But back to that speech. A late addition due to the show's cancellation. Assurance that though Doctor Who was seemingly dead, the legacy of the show was sure to stick around for quite some time. On the 29th of November, Philip Seagull from Columbia Pictures came to the BBC with a request that he would become Doctor Who's new executive producer. He had a plan for the show, to make a made-for-TV feature-length movie in America. Perhaps Doctor Who still had a future.